Hi, this is Dr. John Grazel. Today we focus on Singapore, and we focus on Singapore because it really is, it seems like a very simple, small, and in many cases could be said idiosyncratic example. But in fact, as we'll see, it's sort of a microcosm of the principles of good development. And later, as we discuss other things such as China, actually has been an important element in world international development, even though it developed not according to the classic foreign assistance mode. Uh, Singapore is basically a member of what is very often called the Asian Tigers. These are these Asian economies that seem to have leaped out of poverty into strength. And you have what's called the Asian Tiger Stripes, which is pretty much a formula that they all did together that seems to, as a package, have really worked. Now, what are the formula? It has strong governments, not necessarily democratic, strong government. Those governments exercise strong protectionist policies to protect the development of their own industries. But they had a major emphasis on export, and they were very accepting of foreign investment in their economies. And in everything they did, productivity was a major orientation and measure of success. These countries also, as necessary, accompanied this economic policy with land reform, with investment in education, with investment in infrastructure, and with a emphasis on shared benefits. That doesn't mean that they everybody got an equal amount, but the benefits did cross the benefits really did span most members of the society. So the country as a whole and the populations as a whole felt they were making progress. Okay, now Singapore, as I said, is quite unique. Singapore is a tiny little, you could call it an island city-state off Malaysia. It was a British colony because of what it is. It was a very valuable port into Asia. Uh, and basically was a rough and tumble port with a very mixed population. There were a lot of Chinese. What happened was that when you had decolonization, Singapore didn't become part of Malaysia because it had so many Chinese. There was an ethnic friction, and the Malays did not necessarily want Singapore. So Singapore was cut off on its own and not necessarily something that people thought was going to be such a great success. It started off, besides that, with an interesting heritage as a colony as well, because it had been conquered by the Japanese. As an important port, the British had fortified it to the sea. The Japanese came around, they conquered Singapore, and this was a major, major psychological event in world history in the sense that all of a sudden the colonial world saw that the colonial powers could be defeated by a non-Western army. Uh, be that as it may, that contributed to decolonization. And when Singapore did become free, the person who took over it was named Lee Kuan Yew, who was still a person of power in Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew basically set the directions of Singapore's investments. Now, what did he set that was so important? Well, he came from a leftist labor background, but he bought into capitalist economics. So he sort of had the discipline of you could almost say communism and the economics of capitalism. And he sought for a transformation of Singapore. But he didn't confuse a transformation with sort of a revolution. So Singapore, from what was basically a colonial port, has become an incredible modern city, but you still find in Singapore many signs of the colonial era. A statue of Raffles, one of the famous governors, right there at the Raffles Hotel. There, a stress on, yes, we're modern, yes, we're ever changing, but also we're stable. Uh, what else did Lee Kuan Yew did? He made Singapore an open society, if not in terms of democracy, in terms of participation. It began with what language to use. Since the majority of people were Chinese, they all expected we'll make Chinese our language. And he said, no, we're making English our language because Singapore has to find its place in the world. and the world language is English. So English became the official language of Singapore. He invited in all sorts of people. Yes, there are Chinese, but there are lots of Europeans. There are lots of Indians. There are lots of people from other parts of Asia. Singapore welcomes those who come with skills that it needs. It has all the religions. It has Christianity. It has Buddhism. It has Islam. All are tolerated, but they are tolerated in doing their things within their sub-communities. And there isn't any toleration of sort of expressions of hostility towards each other. What then ties the people together? The economy, business. Lee Kuan Yew basically decided to establish a business state. And he went about it by emphasizing first that Singapore was going to not only become a port that exported other people's goods, but was going to become a center of manufacturing. And so he put in the capacity to manufacture first simple goods and then ever increasing sophisticated goods. He put in an excellent transportation system that allowed everyone to get around Singapore as well as for things to get out of Singapore. So you have a constant circulation in Singapore. He invested, as I said, in education, universal education, and it just wasn't primary education. Excellent high schools, excellent universities, and an ever-increasing emphasis on being world-class in terms of business education, in terms of scientific education, as a competitive edge. So in that sense, there was something for everything. What else did he have? He had very strong governance. And in that sense, Singapore presents a problem for people who are very prone to open democracies. Among the qualities of Singapore is equality under the law. Singapore has extremely strong laws. The one that very often is cited as an example is a $500 fine for chewing gum in Singapore. Now, from a Western perspective, that's a fine for chewing gum in Singapore. From a Singaporean perspective, I've had people say, no, you can chew gum in Singapore. It just costs you $500. He also has very strict laws in terms of drugs and corruption. And what's very interesting is every once in a while, some foreigner is convicted in Singapore of drug trafficking and sentenced to death because Singapore has the death sentence. And then the country of the citizen suddenly gets upset about their citizen being subjected to these draconian measures, even though they support draconian measures on others to suppress the drug trade. It's not the only thing that Lee Kuan Yew suppressed. He suppressed the press and others in terms of outright criticism of the regime. It's not exactly it's not a totalitarian country at all, but it's a velvet authoritarian state. And in that spirit, a constant planning and cooperation among the people through the leadership of that state. So, for instance, they put in birth control. There were dramatic drops in births in Singapore. But along with that came dramatic steps towards equality. So, for instance, if you worked for companies in Singapore, automatically a significant amount of your money went into retirement funds connected with the Singaporean state. If you worked for the Singapore government in many capacities, you got bonuses based on the growth of the Singaporean economy. The idea being that everyone had a stake. We are all engaged together. We have to stay together. And in that way, what looked like at the very beginning a problematic state has become actually one of the richest, well-run nations in the world. And one that doesn't have a major army, doesn't have a navy, and it's hard to imagine anyone is going to go to war with. And in that sense, it represents not only an example of what I would call a developed state and an equity state, but also a state which understood that as war is conflict, peace is an embrace. And what Lee Kuan Yew saw to it was that in a systematic fashion, with cooperation, with equity, and with a concern for the sustainability of their model, at the same time as a capacity to change with circumstances, he did create this very unusual prototype of what it could be very good economic and social development in a rapid period of time.